let me just say a few things. What I want to do with this panel, usually, we always have a panel discussion and then we have questions at the end and discussion. What I want to try is an experiment. So for the people with the microphones, I need you to listen to this, if you're still here. I want to start with the questions and not end with the questions. And they're not going to be questions, and we're not going to go on for very long. But what I would like everyone to think about, and anybody can volunteer, and we'll go from one end of the room to the other. I want to get one sentence from anybody who has a sentence to volunteer, what they think the takeaway is for them from today. So while you think about that, this, to me, is, these are the stars. The moderators, as those of you who've organized conferences know, spend an inordinate amount of time wrangling panelists, thinking about questions. They are probably among the most expert people, and then they have to sit there and then just, try and manage traffic. And we never get a chance to hear what they think. And so this is our opportunity to hear from them what they think. So I've asked them to think about what were the key takeaways, what makes spectrum allocation good or bad, and, given what we've learned today, what should we do going forward? They're going to have the last word. Before I get to them, let's just go around the room to hear from anybody who has a sentence or two for us. What do you think the takeaway is? Anybody up in the gallery there? Nobody in the gallery. We have one. So let's start over there. Just give your name and then give your insight.
Rob Aldifer with Cable Labs. I think the FCC needs to rethink their DSRC policy and provide Wi-Fi access to 5.9 gigahertz.
Well, nothing like a homer to start it off with. That's good.
That was a shocker. All right, okay. So we have gentlemen in the front here, please. That's funny. Just wait for the mic and we get it on the recording.
I just think we need, first of all, the takeaway is it's hard. So for those that have been involved in things that didn't go so well, some forgiveness is due. But as we look to industry to solve some of the technological problems, it occurs to me that some of the fault lays there too as well. Standards bodies where perhaps people did not have the best of intentions to make something work smoothly.
Thank you. Any other insights? We'll get to Richard. We always get to Richard. Let's go around the room. Mark, something.
Hi, Mark Lofquist, student here, ITP, PhD candidate. Work at MITRE, NIST, NAST, and DoD, et cetera. One of my big takeaways was failures are okay because of lessons learned potential. And inaction, there's nothing to learn from that. That was one of the notes I took.
Thank you.
Love that one.
I was able to talk to Pierre about this earlier. Matt Larson from VistaBeam, but about 4 years ago, Pierre introduced harm claim threshold as a new idea in spectrum policy. And after reading it, I feel like it should be the foundation of all new spectrum allocation. They're a big part of the thought process that goes into developing that policy. And I told him it's kind of like at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark when they put the Ark in the box and stuck it in the back of a warehouse. It's kind of like that. So that's my takeaway after listening to all these complexities, that something so simple could probably change a lot of this for the better.
Thank you. And Dan again, and I just wanted to footnote this. In 2012, I was the vice chair of IEEE USA's Committee on Communications Policy, and we did a white paper on harmful interference, and I was gratified to see that it was referenced in the students' compendium, so that was nice. And in that regard, I just wanted to mention that I'm taking away from this conference that, as I think a lot of us know, spectrum policy is an immensely complicated process where, to quote Tom for a moment, when he was up at the front of the room, he said, self-interest can be a big motivator. And as long as that self-interest exists, you're going to have, well, what's the best way to put this? You're going to have economic versus other kinds of mission goals always in opposition, and it's just an interesting thing to consider that the PCAST report from the prior administration is sort of hovering in the room, if you will, as a result of pointing out the monetary value of spectrum. That's a great step in the right direction, and there's a lot of opportunity in front of us. So,
Very good. Next one.
Jordan from CU Login. I think one of the most frequently used words today was flexibility. And I think one of the major takeaways is not to pigeonhole our policy based on specific services or technologies, because those will always be changing. So we need a more adaptive and generalized policy in order to account for those complexities that come up over time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Richard, and then Sarah.
Yeah, I like this format, dude. It's like bullpenning in baseball, where you start with your relievers and don't even have a starter, because, like, what do we need panelists for?
It would make conferences a lot easier to organize, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, paper cutouts or something like that. But
Right.
it occurs to me that in the fullness of time, essentially every system that has ever been designed to use spectrum, and therefore every policy behind it, became obsolete and useless and had to be replaced with something better. So from a certain point of view, every policy, every spectrum initiative is a failure. And see?
Mr. Raisdorf, yes.
Yeah, I mean, we can't control these devices. And so perhaps a key parameter in designing a spectrum initiative is to conceive of the transition at the end of it, when it, when that approach runs out of steam, which it inevitably will, because there'll be new technology, how to do the handoff to a new generation of, spectrum systems.
Very good. Thank you. It looks like we have actually one more, and then we'll go up onto the gallery and get 2 questions there.
Just to key off Richard's last point, that there is always going to be a new challenge and a new technology, and to try to overcome and maximize. The thing I take away from this conference is we're doing an amazing job of spectrum management. Generally, you have enormous expertise both at the FCC and at NTIA. The number of person years of experience probably gets into centuries. I think, to my last question, it's so important that these agencies get sufficient funding so that we can have that expertise from these students into those agencies for the long term. It's not a money-making proposition, but boy, there's passion, there's expertise, and it makes such a huge difference to the economy and the well-being of this country. So I would just urge, whenever we have an opportunity, to urge for that funding to Congress and the White House to make sure that, we do that.
Good.
While we're transitioning to another person, though, I do think it's worth noting it is a money-making exercise, actually, right?
Just pass the microphone.
From a pure revenue perspective, spectrum management makes money for the government, and
Absolutely.
not a single tax dollar goes to it, because between reg fees, auction revenue, and then before you even get to enforcement, fines, you get a lot of revenue. So it is actually worth investing in, because it's net a positive. Even by the bottom
Self-funding
line.
from spectrum auction, whatever, but, just, so, thank you.
Just pass the microphone up. I think we've got a couple more up top there. Blake and Slate.
Well, first of all, congratulations, Pierre. This conference is always a highlight of our year, and I think this year no exception. I have to say, as our Blake Reed at Silicon Flatirons is kind of a resident cynic, I was really excited for this conference this year, as I saw Hall of Shame. We're going to see some real car crashes, and yet, when pressed to dwell on that, we had panel after panel of folks talking about successes, and we heard so much that spectrum policy has done to make the country a better place to bring innovations into our lives. And so the takeaway for me is that for all of its individual and isolated failings, that spectrum policy seems to work pretty well. And the folks who contribute to that in this room ought to be proud of that.
And Slate gets the last word. Yeah.
Fantastic. Mine's short. Slate Herman, University of Colorado Law School. I think one of my biggest takeaways is that one of the key qualities of a failure is how long it's taken us to call it a failure. And I think something that we focused on is, moderate success. We don't learn as much as we do from a big failure. And so I think whether it's DSRC, and we are still doing that now, it's been a long time. Sometimes calling something a failure early out of the gate can stop it from becoming a huge failure.
Fail fast, right. So thank you very much, everybody, and the folks who didn't speak, thank you very much for just participating. Over to you guys. Let's start with Bryan and move over. Just what were your takeaways? First from your panel and then from the event in general.
Well, I think the audience picked up on a bunch of things I thought were really important and interesting. I do think the idea that making mistakes is okay is really important, and trying to draw the lessons from them and, consistent with what Aaron said, not repeating them is very important. I think that the role of experimentation in public policy, I do worry sometimes that our policymakers are reluctant to take those risks. I think David touched on this too. And you have to create enough political space for people to take risks and have them not work out. And I think that's really important.
So that's near to my heart. So tell me how one does that, because my impression is if you're a public servant, there is no upside to taking risks. There is only downside. So why would any public servant take risks? They do. I don't know why. I'm glad they do, but.
Right. I mean, I think a couple of things. I mean, I think Commissioner Rosenworcel has talked about the idea of regulatory test beds in different contexts, and I think that's a powerful way to think about it. I think there has been political momentum around experimentation in public policy for spectrum, for bands, quite frankly, that don't have the same political or the same market demand as others do. And so I do think that gives people some room to do it. And the fact that we historically have not been hyper-partisan in this space has also allowed people to be more, it's not been as clear that the White House is going to call you and say you're making a huge mistake, because it doesn't tend to break as much along political lines. So I do think that's why people do it.
So just building, actually, I would also say one of the big takeaways, and this is just building on what Bryan said, who said a lot of good things as to the audience, is flexibility and the need for flexibility and regulation. And I think that, too, allows a lot of experimentation. If you're not dictated by which technology you're going to use, it does give you some flexibility from a technical perspective to fix things or address things, and I think, even giving a satellite example in the 28 gigahertz band, which is where our broadband satellites today operate. Originally, our satellites were very slow. We were just starting to, you use it, you say 548, that's not, 5.1, that's not broadband. And today we're offering speeds of up 100 megs, and a lot of it's because the rules weren't so constrained that we could design a system that would work in the spectrum in a way that would better meet users and consumers' needs. So I think flexibility is a great one. I also think a light touch, which wasn't specifically talked about, but I'm channeling my old boss, Commissioner Abernathy, who always talked about a light touch to regulation. And a lot of what you're hearing here is that the lighter the touch, the more flexibility, the better off you are. And I think the other thing was Bryan started beforehand talking to the students about property, using property as an analogy, but I think a number of folks brought up that you can't just have a one-size-fits-all. There needs to be unlicensed and both licensed spectrum, and that the unlicensed goes back to the experimentation. That's where a lot of the experimentation occurs as well. So those were my major.
I'd like to unpack the flexibility a little bit because, as we've heard, it was one of the themes. One of the things I think that came up on your panel, Bryan, was, is it flexibility in rights, which is what I think you were talking about here, Jennifer, and what Tom talks about a lot, but it's also flexibility in process. What kinds of flexibility are we talking about? Flexibility in what?
Well, when I think of, it depends. So I didn't really think process. And I didn't really think, property rights from the licensed, unlicensed, but I was thinking more technical flexibility and the ability to make choices. So I think someone brought up, and it's a great example, if we had dictated what cellular technology looks like, we would have chosen TDMA and we would have been a failure, right? And Europe actually sent a letter to the United States complaining because we didn't pick their standard, which still would have been a mistake because I think that's actually held them back for a while. So I think it's the technological flexibility, the ability, you're protecting against interference, but you're not dictating this. I'll give you an example. What's it? E911, which isn't a spectrum. We were there was no 911 capabilities for location accuracy in cell phones, and the FCC had to choose how to implement this. And the commission very wisely didn't say you're going to use X technology, you're going to use a network technology, or you're going to use GPS. It turns out that GPS ultimately won, and actually I would say because of that commission decision, we actually have incredible location-based apps today. That probably would have taken another 10, 15 years to develop, but it's largely because of a decision, but it's a decision that allowed the operators to choose what technology, not saying you should use X or Z.
Great, thank you.
Well, number one, keep the microphone higher. Number two, I think my main takeaway from this is it's a very, very important discussion to have, that there's a lot to be learned and the decision is going to get harder for, as you talk about federal spectrum shared with private spectrum. I think there probably wasn't enough discussion of public safety today and the uses of public safety and how that really affects all of this. So I think it's a discussion that needs to continue. I think it's a terrific forum, and I congratulate all of you for putting this on. And obviously, from my panel, flexibility was a major.
Could you just sketch, what a conversation about public safety might look like? What are the kind of things that one would look like?
Well, I think, and David mentioned FirstNet, and that obviously has to play into it. I think what I'm really suggesting is that, and I get nervous, and I have to admit, I get nervous when everyone seems to agree on everything, on things. And the concept of flexibility, for example, it's a great concept. But I think within that, there still needs to be some room to provide for some kind of overriding policy, light touch, as it were, but public safety communications, the need for them to be accommodated in the spectrum, maybe not just with FirstNet. FirstNet's unknown right now, but maybe that'll solve all the problems. So flexibility is great, and I'm all for it, but I think there's got to be a little bit of tempering of that with the understanding that there's other issues that have to be dealt with in spectrum policy decisions. I mean, otherwise, why do you need an FCC, at the end of the day?
Can I just do one other observation? I do, and I went through a few people's remarks today, but I wanted to come back to it because I think that the notion of being able to figure out when there's a failure and act more quickly and whether or not we need to have a more systematic review of when something's not working so that we can fix it. Because some of the mistakes we make do metastasize in ways that really create cascading public policy problems. And people touched on the garage door openers. I think of our friends, the radar detectors who mess with the VSAT antennas. There are a bunch of examples. I mean, you could argue GPS receivers. But even white spaces, I think you can argue that the commission, that the institutional structures in place to do spectrum management don't respond quickly enough to when something doesn't work. And that there may be a need for a more systematic audit, if you will, on whether or not things are working. Because I do think sometimes mistakes linger too long, and they can create cascading public policy issues for us.
Yeah, I mean, and in fact, I think this takes me to a question that you raised on your panel, which I think was, which is worse, to make, not to make a decision or to make a bad decision. And so what I'm hearing you say now is what we need to be able to do is to recognize when we have made a bad decision. Absent the ability to do that, maybe making a bad decision is not the right answer.
I tend to think that 9 times out of 10, the agencies are going to make the right decision, and even if they're off, it's only going to be by a little bit. So I generally favor error. I'd rather have them make a decision than not. And we had some, Blair was gracious in accepting some dogs that were his. I think every commission, that everybody who's works in the commission could go through a litany of things that they got wrong. But I think net, everybody's prefer to have made the decisions than to let them sit there for.
So are there some mechanisms, what mechanisms would you suggest to actually once, A, to recognize that something has gone wrong, and then B, to roll it back? Because once you create an allocation, you create interests, they vest, and then you can't change them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm completely spitballing this, but you would do something that looks like a 5-year review where you go through all of your allocations to assess whether or not things are working or not. And you would not, and the problem a little bit is the agencies rely on private parties in large part to move before they start looking at whether something works or doesn't. And I think it would be, one answer would be that you would institutionally look at it yourself, and that would be a catch on things. And maybe sunsets would do that as well. If you were to say that a certain licensing regime would sunset after 5 years or have to be re-promulgated, there might be ways to do that, especially for new things. Now, I don't think, do we really need to go back and reassess the CMRS rules every 5 years? I don't know that that's as necessary, but at least for the first 10 years of a new decision or something, you have 2 audits. Maybe there's a path there.
Does the FCC have the money to actually do that?
Well, I want to go back to Sarah's point. They should, and there's no reason the country, if there's ever a place to invest money where you get a return on your investment, it's the FCC and NTIA. So I think they should. It's hard to say what that would look like in terms of what the cost would actually be.
I mean, one of the things that struck me, one of the lessons that I would take, one of the questions that came up in other countries. So in the UK, Ofcom, for example, has had a budget to actually fund independent, it's great to be an engineering consultant in Europe because you get a lot of money from the government. When you propose that kind of thing here, what I hear is essentially lawyers who are used to the adversarial process saying, no, I like having people argue out in front of me. I don't need to fund Julie, to actually do it himself or to pay other people to do a study. So absent that kind of fund, and that's not a lot of money. So do you think that there's a way to get that on the agenda, to get that kind of work funded?
I actually have a slightly different view than you, though.
Oh, good. Let's do that.
So actually what Bryan says kind of scares me from private sector perspective. And one thing that wasn't talked about, I thought enough, was certainty. And different businesses have different risk analyses and different certainty requirements. But I'll give you an example. I'm going to go back to 28 gigahertz in satellite, which actually has been very successful in terms of getting broadband out to rural areas. That band, I was very young when I started, so don't be set off when I tell you, but that band was really put to use for satellite in 1995. Was the first conference where they really foresaw it was then high-speed data, it wasn't even broadband. It was the first conference where they made that spectrum available at the international level because you had Craig McCaw and Bill Gates largely and a number of companies, including mine, who wanted access for these new high-speed data systems that were going to revolutionize things. It was 2008 before the first high-speed satellite was launched, so that was 13 years. When you're designing for space, it's really rough. First off, you're putting a satellite that you can't send a repair truck out to, right? And maybe they'll be on orbit servicing, which would be terrific. But the technology is very difficult to develop. And maybe 13 years is too long. But using that with an audit system and deciding that would be problematic, and then you have people making long-term investments. I get worried, too. I think Richard brought up, maybe you plan for sunsetting. Well, if you have enough flexibility in the rules, there are certain things you want people to reinvest. Steve talked about, how they moved, and I actually just saw something today. One of the companies, Ericsson, has a software that you can put into cell sites to transition from 4G to 5G. So I do get a little worried. I don't think it's wrong, but I would hate to say that there's a standard approach.
There can't be one approach for the 5-year review. That's fair.
And so that's the one issue I would be concerned. But I think on the monetary side, I do think the government is terribly underfunded in these areas.
Okay. Good. So I think with that,
No,
good. So I think we are at time. So I don't want to stand between you and the reception. So we're coming up on the reception. It'll be in the room through there. If you're a student, please go and talk to a practitioner. If you're a practitioner, please welcome a student. You'll be getting a survey in the mail about the conference. Please tell us what we need to do better next time and what you liked about this one. Upcoming events. On the back of your program, there are the events that are coming up in the future. The one that I'm particularly personally looking forward to, there's a conference on the law and economics of data, which is 1 p.m. on Wednesday, November the 14th. Going to be talking about privacy, cybersecurity, antitrust, and content. So I'll see you then, or I'll see you next Spectrum conference. Thank you very much, and thank you to all our speakers today.